So I will now introduce our speaker, Jason Arkles, who many of you will know because he teaches quite often on the History of Art program at the British Institute of Florence. Jason is a historian of art historian, but he's also a practicing sculptor using all the old techniques and making great work with his own studio here in the centre of Florence on the Lungana. Been in Florence for quite a long time, originally trained at Cecil, Charles Cecil Studios over at San Frediano. So Jason's going to talk about the long tradition of American sculptors coming to Europe for training and to Florence in particular. So over to you, Jason.
All right, well, thank you very much, Simon. And good morning and good evening and good afternoon to everyone. Hello, world. Okay, so today, as you know, I'm going to tell you the tale of two sculptors. Now, these two gentlemen, Horatio Greeno and Hiram Powers, were among the dozens of American men and women who, in the 19th century, made the journey to Italy to study and to practice the European tradition of figurative sculpture. They were, in fact, some of the first of this wave. They came. These two figures, Hiram Powers and Horatio Greeno, were at the very forefront of this wave of artists who came to Italy from the United States, starting in the 1820s and extending all the way into the 20th century. Now, many American sculptors, when they came to Italy, made their homes here, settling down and having productive careers working for the clientele of the Grand Tour. And as you know, the Grand Tour is the name given to the custom of travel to the cultural centers of Europe by the young aristocrats and upper classes of Europe and the United States. And while on the Grand Tour, one popular pastime, if you had the money, was to commission works of art which commemorated your travels. Often these took place took the form of portrait busts or copies of antique works that one would see in Rome or Paris or Florence. Bringing home an Italian marble statuette or portrait bust was sort of your proof to your friends of your worldliness and sophistication, especially if you're coming from the rustic backwater of the United States in the 19th century. Now, there are many artists worth mentioning from this very interesting group of emigrants. There's Thomas Ball, Edmonia Lewis, Harriet Hosmer, William Wetmore Story, just to name a few. But we are going to talk about these two fine men right here, Hiram Powers and Horatio Greeno. Two Americans who made Florence their home in the 19th century, studying and then working as sculptors, but they had very, very different backgrounds and very different careers. And so the comparison of their lives and careers is an interesting study of contrasts and similarities. They were both born in 1805, and they are among the first generation of Americans, as I said, who sought European training in sculpture. But they, of course, were not the first American sculptors. The title of America's first career sculptor working in the European tradition belongs to William Rush. Now, William Rush was the son of a ship's carpenter who was then apprenticed to a wood carver. But it's very clear that Rush at some point started looking to Europe for guidance for his carving, right? So in the 1790s, he became a celebrated wood carver, and he made the figureheads and ship's maidens for most of the frigates and gunships of the brand new United States Navy. In fact, it's said that William Rush's exposure to European sculpture was primarily through the figureheads of European ships coming into Boston Harbor. Now, Rush also carved in wood several allegorical figures, two of which you see here. Sadly, none of his maidenheads or ship's figures survive. But we do have these two allegorical figures. They were made as part of a triumphal arch celebrating the visit of the Marquis de Lafayette in 1824, doing sort of a tour, a return to the United States in 1824. Now, Rush's surviving works were done not just in wood, but also a few in plaster and in terracotta. And this kind of shows that Rush had an understanding of how European sculpture typically was constructed. And taken together, taken as a group, these works all show that Rush certainly had some sort of access to images of European sculpture, probably through engravings and other secondary sources, not just, maidenheads on ships. But William Rush's real contribution to American art was his interest in promoting European-style art education in the United States. So a lot of what Rush knew about European art actually came from his friendship and association with the American painter Charles Willson Peale, who had trained in England. And together, in 1805, Peale and Rush founded a small art academy and museum in Philadelphia called the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And the institution is still going strong today. It is the oldest and it is the first art school in the United States. And the Pennsylvania Academy was instrumental in the promotion of art in the early 19th century. It held annual exhibitions. It acquired paintings. It's got a small museum, and it has paintings from artists such as Gilbert Stuart and Thomas Eakins. Now, a few years after the founding of PAFA, as the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts is known, the Boston Athenaeum was instituted. It's a library, and then it eventually became a gallery that really became the center of culture in New England. In 1823, a collection of 9 plaster casts of antique masterpieces arriving from Rome and selected by Antonio Canova himself were acquired by the Boston Athenaeum. And it is largely from these plaster reproductions of antiquities that Americans were first exposed to European sculpture in the flesh, so to speak. So for the interested art lover or aspiring art student who cannot afford a trip abroad, there really wasn't anything beyond what the Boston Athenaeum and the Pennsylvania Academy had to offer in terms of public access to European art. So it was a slow start, to the fostering of the European arts on American soil. So it's no wonder that it wasn't until 1825 that we finally see a young American embark for Europe to receive training as a sculptor for the first time. And it's Horatio Greeno. Now, Horatio Greeno was the son of a prosperous merchant, born in 1805 in Boston, the very year that the Pennsylvania Academy was founded. And Horatio's interest in sculpture was kindled at a very young age by a sculpture in marble that stood in his father's back garden. It was a statue of the Athenian general Phocion, and it was just a contemporary marble copy that Horatio's father had picked up, in his European travels, as you do. Now, Horatio's father was a lover of the classics, and Horatio himself grew up with a strong familiarity with the classics and European culture. He was exposed to this largely through his extensive reading that he did, study on his own. His father had a pretty impressive library for the time. And by the time Horatio was 12 years old, he was making little portrait busts of famous characters from antiquity and also from recent American history. At the age of 12, he even took a sort of lumpy chunk of some sort of local stone, some sort of chalky stone, and he carved a portrait bust of William Penn, the first governor of Massachusetts. And it is said that he taught himself how to model in clay by reading the entry on clay modeling in the encyclopedia. Kind of cute. But anyway, at the age of 16, Horatio entered Harvard University, and he studied the classics and languages and mathematics, but he also kept his interest up in sculpture, and he did so, sort of pursued it on the side. He studied anatomy from a local doctor, for instance. He was really just sort of piecing together the best artistic education he could. But of course, the most significant event from his Harvard years was the donation of these 9 plaster casts to the Boston Athenaeum, these 9 copies of antique masterpieces personally selected by Canova in 1823, which happened during Horatio's 3rd year at school. Now, the collection included things like the Apollo Belvedere, the Torso Belvedere, there was a Venus in there, the Laocoonte, or Laocoon. And so this new exposure to sculpture in Horatio Greeno, just added fuel to the fire. And so in addition to making, copy after copy and drawing after drawing of these plaster casts, Horatio also began making plans to study abroad. And so immediately after finishing Harvard, Horatio Greeno sails for Italy, stopping briefly in Genoa and in Florence before arriving in Rome in the summer or the autumn of 1825. And through his father's connections, he had a letter of recommendation to Bertel Thorvaldsen, the most famous sculptor in Rome. Antonio Canova had died just 3 years before. But Horatio decided to pursue a career, or a course of self-study. He just rented a flat with another young American artist, the painter Robert Weir, and he made a little private studio right in the apartment. And in the mornings, Horatio would go and draw from antiques in galleries or at the Academy of France in Rome, which we see here. You know, this is the studio complex and sort of graduate school where all the winners of the Prix de Rome from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris lived and worked. And so he became familiar with the Prix de Rome winners slightly, and they had a fairly open policy. Horatio was able to go in and make use of their plaster cast collection as well. Now, in letters, dated from this time, early 1826, less than a year into his trip to Rome, Horatio is writing these letters back, talking as though he's like this amazingly worldly, seasoned pro of a sculptor. He's passing judgment on the aesthetics of other sculptors, both as individuals and as representatives of their nationalities. You know, he thought the Italian sculptors were narrow-minded and too focused on bravura carving. He regarded Canova himself as, you know, his work was clever, but it was sort of superficial. You know, Horatio's judgments are perhaps what we might expect from a 21-year-old student eager to show off his newly acquired continental sophistication to his friends and family. But from his letters, we also learn that Horatio had been modeling a few portrait busts, and we learned that he's been working on a figure as well, a life-size figure of a dead Abel. Now, unfortunately, these works were never cast into plaster, and all the work has long since been lost. And it's likely Horatio didn't even have a chance to make a mold of any of these works to cast them in plaster, because before any of that could happen, poor Horatio caught malaria and had to sail back to America in the early spring of 1827, after only a year and a half of self-directed study in Rome. So not a very auspicious start to any sculptor's career, but back in the United States in 1827, it was still a more auspicious education than any other American sculptor had yet pursued. And accordingly, upon his return to the United States and a return to good health, Horatio started taking on portrait commissions. And here's the thing about, you know, young America in the 1820s. Not only were there hardly any sculptors, there were hardly any clients in a position to buy sculpture or commission portraits. But the few there were naturally part of the elite of the United States. And so Horatio, coming back from this year and a half of self-study, he got to do portraits of people like the president of Harvard University, Samuel Appleton, that we see here on the left. He did the financier, John Jacob Astor, and he even sculpted the sitting president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. How easy was it back then? Anyway, the portraits that we see here, well, they're not too bad, considering the limited education that Horatio had up to this point. They're in line with some of the style of, the same style of portraits being produced in neoclassical Rome at the time, although they really are a far cry from first rate. Not that we should give him too much of a hard time for that. But anyway, in May of 1828, having spent just over a year back in the States, Horatio Greeno left once again for Italy, but this time his final destination was Florence. Now, if his career was going so well, sculpting the president, why did he return to Italy? Well, it's because Horatio had only modeled these portraits in clay, but he didn't have any resources and likely at this point no training at all in marble carving in the United States. And so to commit his clay models to marble, he had to take plaster casts of them to Italy to be copied by master carvers there in places like Carrara. And Horatio first came to Carrara. He was there for about 3 months to arrange this copying to be done. But when he was there, Horatio Greeno was deeply impressed by a work he saw in Carrara that was being carved into marble for the sculptor Lorenzo Barcellini. the most prominent sculptor in Tuscany, considered by many to be equal to Canova and Thorwaldsen. And so when Horatio was done in Carrara, he came to Florence and he approached Bartolini, introduced himself, and he asked Bartolini if he would be Horatio's advisor and instructor in drawing and in modeling. And not only did Bartolini agree, but he gave Horatio Greeno an apartment in his very studio in which he could stay. So in Bartolini's studio, Horatio was a very quick study. He was finally getting the education he had been looking for, and he was soon producing much more respectable portrait busts, essentially identical to those being produced by European-born and trained sculptors. And so at 23 years old, Horatio was finally off to a good start in his education. So now that we've gotten through Greeno's formative years, I want to introduce and talk a little bit about Hiram Powers and his journey through his youth and how he ended up in Italy. Though Greeno and Powers were born in the same year, they were born into very different circumstances. Instead of Greeno's genteel upbringing in a prosperous and culturally literate Boston household, attending Harvard and so on, Hiram Powers was the son of a poor farmer in Vermont who moved to Cincinnati, Ohio when Hiram was 13, and Hiram was one of 9 children. Soon after the move to Cincinnati, both of his parents died, and Hiram was more or less raised by his uncle, but Hiram had to leave school to take a job. And he eventually ended up taking a job with a clockmaker when he was 17. And after working for the clockmaker for over 5 years, Hiram decided to move on, and he took a different job that offered him a little bit more creativity and was to Hiram also just a much more interesting job. So Hiram Powers went to work as a general handyman at the Dorfay's Western Museum in Cincinnati. Dorfay's Western Museum. So I couldn't find any visual material of specifically this weird little Western museum, Dorfay's Western Museum. So I'm giving you this image. And so this is from a wax museum in Kansas, and it'll just have to do. But it'll give us an idea. It should give us an idea as to the content of Dorfay's Western Museum. The Western Museum was sort of an exhibition hall filled with various displays and dioramas. You know, there were taxidermied animals, there were geological specimens, all sorts of curiosities. It's almost like a Barnum and Bailey sideshow. Or it's actually probably closer to something between Madame Tussauds and Ripley's Believe It or Not. But one of Hiram's job, and actually the reason he was hired at the Western Museum, his job was to, at first, restore a collection of secondhand wax dummies, these wax figurines, that the owner had recently purchased, but they were in a horrible, terrible state. So not only was Hiram to restore them cosmetically, he was hired to animate them as well because of his clockmaking experience. He was to give the wax figures internal clockworks which would set them in motion as if they couldn't get any creepier. So by the time Hiram Powers was hired for this, right, just to bring Greeno back in to compare and contrast. So Hiram Powers is starting his job working on wax dummies in Cincinnati. At the same time, Horatio Greeno was in Washington, D.C., sculpting the president and about to sail to Italy to study under Lorenzo Barcellini. So they really were worlds apart in many ways. But it is right about this time when Hiram Powers would meet someone who would change the course of the rest of his life. Now, as fate would have it, the 22-year-old Hiram Powers would meet at the Western Museum an English immigrant, a 48-year-old single mother struggling to make ends meet, with the name of Frances Trollope. Now, Frances Trollope, known and remembered today as Fanny Trollope, would, in a few years after meeting Hiram Powers, become one of the 19th century's most recognized writers, famous for her candid and penetrating travel memoirs and observations of life and culture in various nations. She would also be the author of the first abolitionist novel titled Scenes from the Mississippi, a work which directly inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. But in the 1820s, when she met Powers, she was just another struggling immigrant with several mouths to feed. So when Fanny Trollope and Hiram Powers met, the two actually hit it off immediately and would become and stay lifelong friends. And it was Fanny who suggested to Hiram a possible theme for his clockwork wax figures he was assembling at the time. She thought that these broken and misshapen wax figures would be excellent in portraying damned souls in a portrayal of Dante's Inferno. So Hiram Powers was not familiar with Dante, so Fanny Trollope described several scenes from it which struck Hiram's imagination, and he attacked that theme vigorously. Now, unfortunately, Hiram Powers' waxwork Inferno doesn't survive, so I'm just showing you a kind of a campy scene from an old movie portraying Dante's Inferno. But by all contemporary accounts, his rendition of Dante's Inferno was a smash hit at the Western Museum, a 9 days wonder. It got written up in papers all across the state of Ohio. Now, wax dummies in a museum of curiosities, it's not the usual route a sculptor takes to get a career in neoclassical sculpture. But the refurbishing of these dummies did apparently awaken in Hiram an interest in wax modeling. And the real lightning bolt came to him one day when Hiram went to visit the studio of a real sculptor who had just moved to Cincinnati from Philadelphia, the German-born Frederick Eckstein. Now, Frederick Eckstein, his father had actually been the court sculptor to Frederick the Great of Prussia. And so Frederick in Cincinnati in 1826, Frederick Eckstein started up the Cincinnati Academy of Fine Arts. If you've never heard of it, you can be forgiven because it only lasted 4 years. But Hiram Powers studied under Frederick Eckstein during those 4 years, learning modeling, casting, and even carving. And he gained a local reputation as a very competent sculptor, in addition to being an inventive mechanic. Now, eventually, Hiram's talent drew the attention of a local wealthy patron of the arts who encouraged Hiram to try to make his fortune in Washington, D.C. He even funded Hiram's trip and gave him letters of introduction to important contacts in Washington. And so in 1834, at the age of 29, Hiram Powers, who by this time was married and had a child, moved to Washington, D.C. So in 1834, that year, Horatio Greeno, he was in Florence. And so Hiram Powers was actually one of the few sculptors active in Washington. And he, like Greeno before him, received many commissions, including portrait commissions of people like Daniel Webster, different senators, Senator Calhoun, Senator Preston, and eventually the President of the United States at that time, Andrew Jackson. So after 3 years of completing these portrait commissions in Washington, Hiram Powers, like Horatio Greeno before him, sailed for Italy in 1837. Like Greeno, Powers had only modeled these in clay and cast them into plaster, and so he needed to bring them to Italy in order to have them copied into Italian marble, just as Greeno did. And Powers also settled in Florence, where, of course, he met and then became friends with Horatio Greeno, who had been living there for a decade by that point. And like Greeno, finally, Hiram Powers settled into a career making portrait busts for the elites on the Grand Tour. Now let's go back to Horatio Greeno and see where he went from there. Now, being a sculptor on one of the major stops of the Grand Tour put sculptors in touch with the connected and the powerful, because those are the people who went on the Grand Tour. Now, for Horatio, one such person was James Fennimore Cooper, the author of The Last of the Mohicans and The Leatherstocking Tales. James Fennimore Cooper got Horatio, sort of arranged for him a very prestigious commission in Paris, to which Horatio traveled in 1831, and that was this portrait bust here that we see of the Marquis de Lafayette, the second American sculptor to make a statue of the Marquis de Lafayette, after William Rush, of course. But it was Horatio's other prominent artist friend, the painter Washington Allston, who worked on Horatio's behalf to secure for him the greatest commission of his career. So the national government in Washington had decided to commission a colossal statue of President George Washington to go into the Capitol Rotunda. It would not just be a flagship sculpture of the New World, it would be an icon of the nation itself, the most important work of art commissioned up to that point by the United States. And the commission, on Washington Allston's recommendation, went to Horatio Greeno in 1832. And here we have it. Now, Horatio predicted that this statue would take 4 years to produce, but in fact, it took almost twice that time. Now, the statue, of course, is of George Washington. He's seated, he's got one arm raised, pointing to the sky, which is a nod to a sculptor, a Greek sculptor, Phidias, and his seated statue of Zeus, now lost, but the pose was known. So the pose is a direct reference to the antique. And with the other hand, he's holding out a sword with the hilt facing outward. And this is to symbolize Washington's relinquishment of authority after the American Revolution, when he easily could have been crowned a new king of the United States. Now, this seated figure is indeed colossal. It's over 11 feet tall, over 3 meters tall. And the commission contract for this work stipulated that the portrait, the face of George Washington, had to be made from a life mask that was made 50 years earlier. It's an impression taken directly off of the living George Washington that was made by the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon. And indeed, there's a very close resemblance in Horatio Greeno's Washington here, very close resemblance to the standing figure of Washington that Houdon completed decades before. They were using the same source material, this plaster cast. But beyond the American government's general notion that the statue should be done in the popular neoclassical style, the neoclassical style in architecture, of course, strongly informed the architecture of the Capitol building itself. So they said, well, it has to be neoclassical. But that was it. They didn't really impose too much restriction or give much direction to Horatio. And he was left to his own devices in terms of how the work in general should be rendered. And maybe that wasn't such a good idea, because the problem is Horatio Greeno, his expertise and his judgment was, it has to be said, limited. His understanding of neoclassicism didn't really go much further than a notion of what an ideal figure should look like, and the notion that an ideal figure should be made because it was popular and desirable. Now, the problem with this arises with the coupling of this idealized, classicized, heroic torso with a naturalistic portrait based on a life mask. They're two very, very separate modes of working, and it's not done often that you would combine these idealized, or this degree of idealization with this degree of naturalism. And so the effect is just a little bit jarring. It was especially jarring to the older generation in Washington, D.C., who had actually known and seen Washington during his lifetime. And the statue of Washington, when it came back, it met a very critical response once it was installed into the Capitol Rotunda. You know, the bulging muscles of this heroic, bare-chested George Washington seemed ridiculous to most people. And even sometimes it was considered offensive or scandalous. And so the statue didn't last long in its prominent position. Taking down statues is nothing new to the United States. Happens for a lot of different reasons. And so after its installation in the Capitol Rotunda in 1841, it was removed to the lawn of the Capitol in 1843. So it only stayed in place for 2 years. And we see it out on the lawn here. To a location much less prestigious, but at the same time more public. And the statue never really gained in respect or reputation. And so finally, in 1908, after 60 years sitting outside, it was moved back indoors, but to the Smithsonian Museum, where it is still on display. And it's not seen as the icon of the young republic as it was intended, but really as an historical curiosity. Now let's go back to Mr. Waxwork, Hiram Powers, and see if he fared any better in his career. So Hiram Powers turned his attention when he arrived at Florence to several subjects. Obviously, he was doing portrait busts and busts of mythological figures as well. That was his bread and butter. But he also developed an interest in nude figures, a sight seldom seen in the United States, nude figure statues, that is. But of course, it's a sight which is pervasive in the streets and museums of Florence. And his first major attempt at an ideal nude came in the early 1840s, and we see it here. It's a statue called Eve Tempted. Now we see Eve holding an apple in her hand, and there's a serpent coiling around the tree stump. It's a very simple pose and a very simple idea, but it's done exceedingly well. There are obviously idealizing elements within the figure, but it's not just a direct copy of the Venus de Medici. There's a certain vitality of the living model, the living nude model that sort of shines through, revealing that Powers had evidently mastered working from the nude, from life, before attempting this. And Eve Tempted here is just one of several female nudes that he created during the 1840s. And his nudes were widely admired by all who passed through his studio, but that's just about the only place you could see them. They were displayed as plaster casts in his studio, but his first figures just couldn't find a buyer willing to commit them to marble, at least not for some time. And so they remained in his studio, unknown to all except his visitors, who universally admired them. And portrait busts for the clientele of the Grand Tour remained his bread and butter. But in 1843, after Hyrum had been living in Florence for more than 5 years, he was reacquainted with an old friend, none other than Fanny Trollope, who had relocated to Florence and who was by now a famous writer. Now, Trollope was dismayed when she encountered Hiram Powers and saw that his career was rather stagnant. And it seems likely that Fanny Trollope suggested or otherwise influenced Hiram Powers' next choice of subject in his exploration of the ideal nude. Now, Trollope, as we know, was a strong and vocal activist, abolitionist, and her anti-slavery novel, Scenes from the Mississippi, had just been published a few years before she settled to Florence. So we find in 1843, soon after Trollope's arrival, Hiram Powers addressing the issue, turning his attention to the issue of slavery in sculpture with a work that he called The Greek Slave. Here we see it. Now, this was the work that would not only skyrocket Hiram Powers to international fame, and not only would this sculpture prove to be an incredibly potent symbol for the anti-slavery movement, on a par with the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, but this sculpture would also be the sculpture that would drag the prudish mindset of the American public into acceptance of the nude figure in art. Now, as we see, it's a late neoclassical styled female nude in a pose very similar to the Medici Venus, which, of course, by this time had been copied and emulated by dozens of sculptors over hundreds of years. She stands in a very simple contrapposto, one hand placed upon a draped post. Now, the conceit, which indicates that she is a slave, is, the fact that her wrists are shackled to that post. She's basically just a Venus in chains. And if we don't know the context, we would think that, the title and the chain, Greek slave, and there's chains. We would think that as a pretty shallow justification for displaying what is ostensibly a female nude inspired by a famous antique. But in fact, the work directly references an actual historical conflict that had resolved itself only 10 years before the Greek slave was modeled. So the nation of Greece had won its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1832. And the Greek fight for independence aroused the intense interest of people in Europe and in the United States because the conflict was seen as representative of certain ideas, right? It had something to do with the ideals of the United States, which of course had modeled its relatively new government on ancient Greek democracy. And so the contemporary nation of Greece was kind of seen as a kindred spirit. The conflict just absolutely struck the imagination of the West, and it became the inspiration for many works of art and many works of literature. And in the context of the Greek War of Independence, we see that the Greek slave, she's not a mere allusion to the antique. She represents a contemporary Greek woman, fallen into the clutches of the heathen enemy, right? So to reinforce the idea that this woman is one of us, right, and rather than the enemy, Hiram Powers places two small items in her chained hands. And you can see in the close-up on the right. She has a cross and a locket sort of dangling off the post down there. Now the cross indicates, of course, that she's a Christian, and the locket alludes to perhaps her loved ones who would come to her aid if only they could. And I'm not just making this up here. Let me read you a description of the work written by Hiram Powers himself around the time of its unveiling in 1843. This is what he wrote about his sculpture. He says, "The slave has been taken from one of the Greek islands by the Turks in the time of the Greek Revolution, the history of which is familiar to all. Her father and mother, and perhaps all her kindred, have been destroyed by her foes, and she alone preserved as a treasure too valuable to be thrown away. She is now among barbarian strangers, under the pressure of a full recollection of the calamitous events which have brought her to her present state, and she stands exposed to the gaze of the people she abhors, and awaits her fate with intense anxiety, tempered indeed by the support of her reliance upon the goodness of God." Right? So that was the idea. Now, with this sort of subtext, we can understand why this work was so popular in the 19th century. It uses the neoclassical idiom, an idiom that is supposed to evoke ancient times. It uses that idiom to speak to contemporary issues, right? Few and far between are the neoclassical sculptures that actually directly spoke to the contemporary audience, especially in the United States. And so as a consequence, the Greek slave was a sensation. And there was an insatiable demand for this statue. It was copied into marble on its full scale at least 6 times that we know of. There are numerous bootleg copies of it. You could buy reductions of it in different materials, including porcelain. You can buy it as a portrait bust, as we can see on the left. It was exhibited in 1845 in London. It was taken to the United States in 1847 and then returned again to England in 1851. It went on a world tour. It was so popular. Writers and commentators from Nathaniel Hawthorne to Maria Lowell wrote about it, and poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote poetry inspired by it. And of course, just the fact that it speaks to a contemporary audience, that's where we start our discussion with the Greek slave. In America and for Americans, the work naturally had an added significance and relevance, coming as it did not long before the Civil War in the United States, with the abolitionist movement growing stronger every year, matched in vigor by the pro-slavery sentiment. The Greek slave was a perfect piece of propaganda for the abolitionists, because in the Greek slave, and we got to sort of put ourselves in the context of levels of racism in the 19th century, but in the Greek slave, free white Americans could empathize with one of their own in captivity, the Greeks, the Greek slave being one of our own, could empathize with one of their own in captivity much more than perhaps they could had the statue depicted an African American slave, right? It made broaching the subject itself more palatable. And it effectively brought both the horror and the hypocrisy of slavery home to many white people who observed the statue when it toured the United States. So the anti-slavery sentiment in the Greek slave is just one way in which the statue raised eyebrows back in the United States, but the real commotion it caused was, of course, its nudity. Now, it was common practice in American museums like Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and the Boston Athenaeum. It was the usual practice that men and women would have separate viewing times for works of art which depicted the nude. And it seems an almost impossibly prudish and quaint thing to do, but it has to be remembered that naked flesh the representation of naked flesh in America was literally nowhere to be found represented publicly. So separation of the sexes was really just a way of avoiding embarrassing social mistakes in what was a completely unfamiliar social situation, right? But the neoclassical ideals which nudes strove to represent in Europe were largely lost on the American public, who had no experience. They had no guidance in looking past the materiality of the nude towards loftier sentiments, right? So it was inevitable that what many in America saw in a Venus when they came to Europe, or an Adonis when they saw nudes, for many people, it was nothing more than an exposure of flesh, ostensibly for the sake of revealing that flesh, and therefore lascivious. But Hiram Powers' Greek slave changed all of that. Because in terms of motive, the Greek slave is practically the opposite of a Venus, right? From who, she takes the pose from the Venus, but the Greek slave is not an unashamed, nude pagan goddess of love. No, the Greek slave is a faithful Christian. She's unclothed, not by choice, but she's stripped of her garments against her will by her enemies, right? Her nudity then becomes not a subject of scorn or lust, but one of pity. This was the sort of nude with which one could empathize and still retain propriety. Now, when this statue arrived to the US in 1847 and was put on display at the National Academy of Design in New York at their annual exhibition, it was placed on a revolving pedestal so it could be turned around for different views and effects of light, but also because it was placed with a large velvet curtain behind it, so that spectators who wished to see the other exhibits in the same room would not be unwillingly exposed to the Greek slave. Of course, the curtain was largely unnecessary because the Greek slave drew in hundreds of viewers every day, people traveling from hundreds of miles away just to see it. It was a sensation. So there you go, two American sculptors with very different backgrounds, one beginning fairly humbly, the other basically born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but arriving in to very, very different careers. And of course, Powers and Greeno were just two of the dozens of sculpture students who traveled to Italy in the 19th century to study and live. And of course, that is a tradition that continues on to this day. And I'd like to end this lecture by mentioning an interesting link between the world of 19th century Florence and its community of expatriate artists and my own experience in Florence. You see, Lorenzo Barcellini, when Lorenzo Barcellini, the teacher of Horatio Greeno, died in 1850, his chief assistant, Pasquale Romanelli, inherited his studio and finished Barcellini's unfinished works. Now, Pasquale Romanelli had a successful career as a sculptor on his own, as did his son, Raffaello Romanelli, and also Raffaello's son, Romano Romanelli, three generations of Romanelli sculptors in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century. But the building is still owned by the Romanelli family. And after a two-generation hiatus, the current generation of Romanellis, the brothers Raffaello and Vincenzo Romanelli, are once again sculpting. Now, since the 1980s, a portion of this historic studio, this building, has been rented out to the American painter Charles Cecil, under whom I studied and learned to become an artist. And the Charles Cecil studio occupies the upper floor of the Lorenzo Barcellini and Romanelli family studio to this day. And so it happens that I received my training as a sculptor within the same walls that Horatio Greeno, the first American sculptor to receive European training. And it wasn't until after I had started to train as an artist, it took a couple of years, I think, for me to learn enough and hear these stories of the history of the building I was working in and its former occupants. And these stories just made art history so tangible to me. You know, of course, Florence goes a long way in doing that already. You can walk down the street and be where John Bologna and Michelangelo and all the rest had been and see what they made. But to live and work in a similar fashion and in the same rooms as past masters, it ignited not just a passion for devouring art history, but it also gave me an unshakable and tangible sense of being a part of a continuum, right? history isn't something that happened in the past. It's still going on. I have a sense of being part of the story that we read about in the history books. And whether as artists or as patrons or friends and supporters like Fanny Trollope, we are all characters in the next chapter of the history of art, should we choose to pursue it. So thank you very much. I shall now take you off screen sharing so I can see if there's anyone left. Yes,
Yeah.
there are a few.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Yes.
Fascinating talk, and I love the link to your own experience and practice. That's outstanding. So, as per usual, if anybody would like to make a comment, ask a question, please unmute yourself and fire away.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
Hi, Sally.
A fantastic lecture. You're very, very delightful, and I hope you come back in September. I enjoyed this very, very much. You're lots of fun.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I get much too worked up when I talk about sculpture. I enjoy it maybe a little bit too much.
Jason.
Yeah.
Jason, hi, it's Katie from Nantucket. Nice to see you. How are you? This is a great lecture. Thanks so much. And I just wanted to ask, the Academy of France in Rome, is that the old Medici Palazzo?
Indeed it is. Yes, it is.
I recognized all those niches.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Great lecture. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Thanks.
All right.
Jason, does your Isabel here, does your own statuary or sculptures in any way echo any of the previous ones that you've been talking about, or is it totally different?
No, they're similar in a certain way. It might seem strange to people who don't practice sculpture, figurative sculpture, but nowadays, contemporary figurative sculpture is, by and large, in studious avoidance of storytelling. Ever since Rodin, 5 generations ago, when Rodin was basically the first sculptor to say, well, I can make a figure and I don't have to attach all this cultural baggage to a sculpture. I don't have to give my figure, it doesn't have to be a historical person or a biblical person or a mythological person. I don't even have to give them an identity. Just do a figure, for figure's sake, flesh for flesh's sake. And it was a brilliant idea then. And everyone in the last 5 generations has continued to think it's a brilliant idea, to the exclusion of doing something a little bit more difficult, which is actually using your sculpture to tell a story. And so I'm sure it will shock you all to learn that my background, before I was a sculptor, I was involved in theater. And I learned as a writer and director. And so I learned the process and the mechanics of storytelling in a completely different medium. And when I became a sculptor, I naturally gravitated towards those sorts of sculpture, which is basically everything before Rodin, and pursue it in my own work. I like to do characters that have motives and histories and futures. I tell stories with my work. So among my contemporaries, I'm not notable, but I am different from most others around me for that pursuit. And of course, that ties in, there's not a sculpture that you saw here tonight that didn't have an identity tied to a story, whether it's biblical or mythological. The Greek slave isn't a story we know, but it tells a story. It is a narrative sculpture. And in the realm of narrative sculpture, you can also include allegorical works. Sculptures can be narrative and allegorical at the same time. Michelangelo's David is a great example of that. He's narrative in the sense that you can see he's about to take the sling and fight the giant. So we're seeing a scene from the story, but at the same time, he's an ideal nude. And we know that David wasn't, buff and ripped like that. He was a 14-year-old shepherd boy, and he certainly wasn't naked when he fought the giant. But those attributes, the idealization and the nudity, are there to point the viewer in the direction of realizing that there's more to this story than the story, that we should be looking past it and consider David in the larger context of his meaning.
You know something.
That's what so I'm allegorical and.
What about you?
But that's about as far as I go. I'm not a neoclassicist by any imagination.
Thank you, Jason. Very interesting.
There's a question in the comments, Jason, which builds naturally that is some Patricia asked, where can we see some of your work?
Oh, where can you see some of my work? Well, you can use the internet for much more than just Zoom. You can go to jason.com, but you won't see a lot of my recent work on there. I'm working on several large-scale over life-size figures right now, building my first exhibition ever. I don't exhibit, I don't sell in galleries. I'm very lucky to be able to make my bread and butter by doing Zoom lectures and whatnot, and teaching out of my own studio. And so I have the luxury of not needing to produce sculpture for a market. And this gives me the opportunity to do my own explorations. And it's taken me a while to figure out exactly what I want to do, and taken me a little while longer to actually be able to affect these things. So current work you won't see much unless you come to my studio in Florence, and you're all welcome to. And if you do, you will see one sculpture out in the public in Florence on the facade of St. Mark's English Church on Via Maggio. Above the main doors of the church, there's a niche, and in that niche is a life-size marble statue of St. Mark. And I carved that in 2008. And since I'm tooting my own horn, I might as well let it drop that I am the only American, living or dead, to have a permanent monument on the cityscape of Florence, life-size marble monument like that, which is doubly surprising considering all the people like Hiram Powers, like Horatio Greeno, like all the rest of the sculptors in the 19th century who came here and made their careers here and had much better careers than I have had, that their work isn't to be seen except in museums. Obviously, Hiram Powers has work in the Pitti Palace, but on the cityscape of Florence, if you're looking for American sculpture, which you really shouldn't be if you're coming to Florence, you'll find me.
Jason, this is Molly Kellogg from Santa Barbara.
Hi.
Wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll come back and speak in the fall, and would you consider addressing the issue of sculpture in Florence in the 20th century, particularly with respect to changes in materials that are being used?
In the 20th century, or like also including the first 2 decades of the 21st sort of thing?
Yes, of course. Yeah, that would be really terrific.
Yeah, I could do that. It's out of my wheelhouse, 20th century sculpture. Well, I mean, I really am a very narrow-minded person for an art historian. I really focus on figurative stuff, and there are some interesting 20th century sculpture here in Florence. Yeah, maybe.
Give it a thought.
Yeah. Who else? Come on.
Jason, I really like the sculpture you did of John Honig.
Oh, the portrait bust.
The portrait bust.
Oh, thank you.
It had that sort of strange look. It looked like him whatever way you looked at it, but you saw two sides of him, the very, very serious side and the slightly more smiley side. And I thought that was done brilliantly. So I just like to make that comment.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right.
Oh, good.
Jason, thank you.
Hi, Tessa, there you are. You're most welcome. Tessa.
That was great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Of course, you've heard me talk way too much over the years.
I need it.
Tessa is one of my recurring students. She's been coming to Florence for the last 4 years, carving marble with me in my studio. And she's doing does fantastic work on her own as well up in England. So great to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great to see you. I'll be back.
All right.
I can't see you, Tessa.
Jason, it's Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy.
Long time no see.
Yeah, it's been hours.
I just wanted to add on to what Tessa said, because it reminded me that when I have the opportunity to host students from the University of Buckingham here for their Florence term, you've always kindly invited us to come and visit the studio and look at equipment and see demonstrations of marble carving and, you know, the ways that one gets from a clay model to a plaster cast to a marble investment. And Tessa has often been in the studio working when I've brought my students. And I just wanted to share with all of you that the sight of a British woman just sort of, you know, hammering into marble and making beautiful work was something that they certainly didn't expect. And I think it's a great way also for students who are studying art history and heritage management to see that while this has been sort of, you know, a man's realm, you know, up until relatively recently, it has been adopted. Of course, there are historical exceptions, but it has been commented several times, you know, how lovely it was to see someone studying marble carving, you know, from a background perhaps that they didn't expect. So your studio has lots of things to offer young minds coming to learn about sculpture, but also about life and profession and passion and choosing to be an artist. So it's always been a great experience. I just wanted to share that with all of you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Jason brings out the best. That's the answer. Enthusiasm.
I make it easy for myself by only allowing the best into my studio, Tessa.
Including my undergraduates.
Yes.
Risky.
This is degenerating into a total love-in. It's fantastic.
Right? Keep going, keep going. Come on, guys. I have nothing else in my life. This is what I live for.
All right. Any more questions or comments? Or messages of love for Jason?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I'll print them out.
All right. Well, we've just gone past the hour.
Perfect.
So if we're kind of getting to the end, I'll just thank you all for coming and thank Jason very much on behalf of everyone for a truly interesting and insightful talk about the backstory, why he's here, and the tradition he's a part of. Remind you one more, last time before the summer break, last chance to donate to the British Institute and the Firenze per Firenze campaign for the city of need. And otherwise, I'll leave you all to have a great summer, wherever you may be. Stay safe, stay well.
Please do.
We gotta get some downtime, stop worrying about the world. And we'll see you all back in September, either in person here at the Palazzo or on the Zoom. All right. And thanks all, really, from the bottom of my heart, for supporting this big, brave experiment, which has gone far better than I ever thought it could do. So thank you.
Great.
Buonanotte tutti.
Buonanotte.
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 Bye, guys.